So as I said, the Slaughterhouse Cases were the first case the United States Supreme Court took up, which attempts to interpret the Civil War amendments. And this case, in very particular, had absolutely nothing to do with racial discrimination or slavery, um, and instead dealt with a very particular matter within the state of Louisiana. So what occurred in the Slaughterhouse Cases is the state of Louisiana passed a law which granted a 25-year monopoly to a state-owned slaughterhouse. And what this meant was the butchers within the area, primarily within New Orleans, but the butchers in the area either had to work for the monopoly or they couldn't ply their trade. So butchers which were not included in the monopoly, so any sort of butchery that owned its own business, was in essence put out of business. And they argued that their rights were deprived them, and they were deprived in a fashion by which violates the 13th and 14th Amendment. The 13th Amendment being because if they wished to ply their trade, they were forced to work for the state. They had no other mechanism by which to gain employment in their trade. In the 14th Amendment violation, they claim because that individuals who were actually included in the monopoly were treated functionally different than individuals who were not included in the monopoly. Furthermore, the individuals who were not included in the monopoly had no due process rights by which to press their claim. So there are a number of issues in this case. First, does the 13th Amendment apply to state-employed monopolies? And does the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and Privileges and Immunities Clause apply to individuals who were not slaves, freed slaves, or descendants of free slaves? And the Supreme Court says that none of the law in question in Louisiana does not violate the Constitution. And the reason they say that is that the Civil War amendments were passed very clearly in reaction to slavery, and that any fair and just construction of these amendments must look to the purpose of the amendments as to the evil it was designed to remedy, and that evil was slavery. Since these amendments were designed to remedy discrimination against African Americans, both from the states, it didn't apply to any sort of discrimination that wasn't against African Americans. And the reason for this is that they argue that the people who drafted this amendment, and understand, we're not talking about what did the founders intend. We're literally asking in 1873 what individuals who ratified something in 1864 meant. So they're talking about people who are very much still alive. Their argument is they didn't want to destroy the federalist nature of the United States, so that states had autonomy to regulate within certain areas. And so they really were only attempting to reach slavery. And so the 13th and 14th Amendment simply don't apply to the butchers because the 13th and 14th Amendment were never intended to apply to individuals who were not slaves. And thus, the state law in Louisiana is valid based upon the state's police powers. The state can regulate in that fashion. And thus, this case really and significantly limits the effect of the 13th and 14th Amendment, primarily the 14th Amendment, that it really limits where the 14th Amendment can apply. This case also, as you'll recall, discusses the idea of incorporation and incorporating certain amendments to the states via the 14th Amendment. They give it some due time and discussion, but ultimately weigh in that incorporation was not an intention. But we've covered that previous in this class, so there's no need to worry about it in the confines of this decision. There are two dissents in this case, Justice Field and Justice Bradley. Justice Field dissents, and in particular arguing about the privilege and immunities clause, um, says that in essence, there's a privilege and immunities clause in Article 4 of the Constitution. And that privilege and immunities clause in Article 4 um, protects citizens of one state from hostile actions of another state. That's why this privilege and immunity clause in Article 4 exists. Thus, he reasons that the 14th Amendment's privilege and immunity clause um, does the same for every citizen from discriminatory acts, no matter what state they reside in. So his argument is that if the privilege and immunities clause of Article 4, which shares very similar language to the privilege and immunity clause of Article 14, or the 14th Amendment, um, means a certain thing, then obviously it should mean the same thing in the 14th Amendment, that you can't interpret similar language in two different ways. Justice Bradley views that this was functionally a due process violation, that these individuals were denied the pursuit of employment, and they were done so in a fashion that basically allowed them no appeal and no ability to claim their case once it was denied, and therefore he claims it would be a violation of due process. But that the end of this case is it really confines the 13th and 14th Amendment, primarily the 14th Amendment, in a very particularized space. And that space is the 14th Amendment, both the Equal Protection Clause and the Privileges and Immunities Clause, exist almost solely to handle issues of discrimination on the basis of race, almost exclusively African American discrimination from the state, so that any other type of discrimination that states may engage in wouldn't necessarily run afoul of the 14th Amendment. So despite the language as it's written, the Slaughterhouse Cases really limit the effectiveness of using the 14th Amendment as a vehicle to make broader right claims across the United States.